You are listening to the podcast From Israelite to Jew with Michael Sadlow, Episode 19, Josephus. Imagine if we did not have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Clearly, our knowledge of ancient Jewish sectarianism, of the history of the biblical text, of the variety of ancient Jewish texts and religion would all be impoverished. We would be back to where we were before their discovery some 50 years ago, with a good basic sense of the outline of the history of the Jews in the period of the Second Temple, but with many of the details missing or simply incorrect. But now imagine what our history would look like if instead of lacking the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't have Josephus. It would not be that our history would be impoverished. There basically wouldn't be a history. There would be no outline to fill in. An incredible amount of our knowledge of the period, particularly from the Hasmonean period through the destruction of the temple, depends on Josephus's narrative. Writing such a history, or indeed making this podcast, without Josephus is almost unimaginable. Josephus, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, has been our guide through much of this series, and it is finally time to get to know him a little bit better. But first, it is worth pausing to consider how it is that the works of Josephus survived. Josephus is so important not because he was the only historian writing about the Jews in antiquity, but because he has written the most complete history that has survived. Josephus himself tells us of competing histories. Why, though, did none of them survive, but his did? The works of Josephus did not survive because Jews avidly read him and preserved his text within their living communities. They didn't. There is no evidence at all that Jews cared very much about him until the late Middle Ages, and by that time they had to recover him from manuscripts kept by Christians. No, the survival of Josephus's work is instead due to a stranger and more serendipitous set of circumstances. The 7 books of his work, The Jewish War, the 20 books of his magnum opus, Jewish Antiquities, his autobiography, Life, and his 2-book apologetic tract Against Apion, were all preserved because of a single clause, one that is in fact most likely forged. In the Jewish Antiquities, Book 18, Josephus interrupts his narrative of Pilate with the following paragraph. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not live up to their affection for him. On the 3rd day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. There has been debate about whether Josephus really wrote this or whether it was a later addition. There is less debate over the sentence asserting that Jesus was the Messiah. That line is almost certainly a forgery. Yet it was that line especially that made Josephus, in the eyes of the early church, a witness to Christ's divinity. And in so doing, Josephus's full literary output was thought worth preserving. So in the end, we owe our knowledge of ancient Jewish history not to Jews, but to the church. Toward the end of his life, Josephus wrote an autobiography. At least some of it we must take with a grain of salt. As he himself says, he wrote it in response to an attack on him by another author. In this autobiography, Josephus tells us that he was born in Jerusalem in the year 3637 CE, the first year of Gaius Caligula's reign. His mother was a descendant of the Hasmoneans, and his father was a notable priest. Josephus was thus very much of the upper crust of Judean aristocracy. He claims to have been a bit of a childhood genius, By the time he was 14 years old, the chief priests and other leaders would come to consult him, he says. The content of his education is uncertain. He tells us that he spent a few years investigating different Jewish groups. He apparently learned some Greek. Even near the end of his life, he remained apologetic about his pronunciation, though. As he tells us elsewhere, when he set out to actually write his history in Greek, he thought it prudent to hire assistants to help him with the language. His mother tongue was Aramaic. In 66 CE, at the beginning of the war against Rome, he was appointed to lead the Jewish forces in the Galilee. His account of his activities over the next year is convoluted. On the one hand, he goes to great pains to tell us how devoted he was to the cause of the revolt, and how clever he was as a military leader. On the other hand, and here we must remember that he was writing this in Rome after Rome had won, he tells us that he consistently urged the Jews to make peace with Rome. In any event, he did not last for long. The next year, in 67 CE, he was captured. According to his account, after the fall of Jopata, a city in the Galilee, the Romans set out to search for Josephus, since they thought that, according to Josephus' somewhat inflated account, quote, the issue of the war depended largely on his capture. Josephus escaped and hid in a cave, though, with a number of others. As the Romans closed in, and despite his objections, his colleagues made a suicide pact. They followed his suggestion of drawing lots to implement it. He tells us, each man thus selected presented his throat to his neighbor, in the assurance that his general was forthwith to share his fate. For sweeter to them than life was the thought of death with Josephus. It was undoubtedly coincidence that at the end of the slaughter, Josephus was left with one other man. And he continues, the two of them, quote, anxious neither to be condemned by the lot, nor, should he be left to the last, to stain his hand with the blood of a fellow countryman, be persuaded, this man also, under a pledge, to remain alive. So much for a sweet death with Josephus. Josephus thus surrendered to Vespasian. In a private audience with the general, he predicted that he, Vespasian, would soon become emperor of Rome. Vespasian was no fool, but he was unsure about what to do with him. Josephus tells us he maintained him as a prisoner, but treated him exceptionally well. So for the next 3 years, Josephus apparently went along with Vespasian as a prisoner. He tells us little about what he did during this time. His big moment, though, seems to have come in 70 CE, as Vespasian returned to Rome to become emperor, and Titus was preparing for the final siege and assault of Jerusalem. Josephus delivered a long, eloquent, and impassioned speech to the besieged Jews of Jerusalem, imploring them to surrender. Not only are they for all practical reasons doomed, he argued, but also they have already been abandoned by God. We will return to this speech in a couple of episodes. The speech was in Aramaic, and despite Josephus' attempt to portray it in the best light, it appears to have been a complete failure. Josephus, during his exhortation, he admits, referring to himself in the third person, was derided by many from the ramparts, by many execrated, and by some assailed with missiles. Could anyone have heard him above the din? Even if they could, his speech had no practical effect other than perhaps reinforcing Titus's confidence in him. Jerusalem, of course, fell, and I will discuss this further in another episode. Titus soon returned to Rome with shiploads of Jewish slaves to be marched through the streets as part of the victory triumph before they were sold. Josephus returned with Titus, but he was no longer in chains. Under the patronage of Vespasian, Titus, and their descendants, the Flavians, Josephus was able to settle comfortably in Rome and write. It is from his patrons that Josephus took his new name, Flavius Josephus. Josephus wrote his first work, The Jewish War, in the 70s. It was probably first composed in Aramaic, although it survives only in Greek translation. Josephus tells us that he wrote his history to set the record straight. There were many other histories of the war already, but they were all equally deficient. "I thought it monstrous," he writes, "to allow the truth in affairs of such moment to go astray." He was particularly irked by the way in which these other historians portrayed the Judeans as a weak and puny people. How could such a people hold off the might of Rome for as long as they did? The Jews, Josephus claims, fell not because they were in any way inferior, but because they first fought each other. Internal conflict defeated them. Take it from Josephus in Eyewitness. All historians must pick a beginning point in time for their narrative. It is by no means obvious where the history of most events actually begins. Josephus began his history in the Jewish war at the time of Antiochus IV and the revolt of the Maccabees in the 160s BCE. He moves very quickly, though, through the Hasmonean period before spending much time on Herod's reign. One important reason for this imbalance appears to have been the availability of an extensive source of Herod's life, the writings of Nicolaus of Damascus, whom I've already mentioned in an earlier episode. Josephus devotes little attention to the period between Herod and the events leading directly to the revolt. His account picks up speed with the beginning of the revolt in 66 CE. We will talk in the next episode about these causes, but it is worth noting here that Josephus hardly gives a clear answer on this issue. In fact, the relative absence of attention that he gives to this question, and the confused answers that he suggests, might in their own right be telling. The Jewish war focuses not on the causes of the Jewish revolt, but on its prosecution and its outcome. The two questions that seem to drive Josephus in this book are, why did the Jews lose? And who was really at fault for destroying the temple? The answers that Josephus provides to these questions, I think, go far in revealing his agenda. The Jews, he repeatedly asserts, fought valiantly. They revolted in response not to general Roman oppression, but in legitimate response to the actions of a few bad Roman procurators. They lost, though, because they very soon began to fight among themselves, thus also losing divine favor. And it was this internal strife, rather than Rome's crushing superiority, that led to the destruction of the temple. Titus did not want the temple destroyed. He did most everything he could to prevent the destruction. It was the chaos of war, the infighting of Jews, that continued to the very last moment, and dumb bad luck that led to the conflagration that ultimately destroyed the temple. Although that admittedly simplifies Josephus's explanations, I think that the outline is sound enough for us to hazard some guesses about why Josephus would present his narrative in this manner. Remember that the first edition of the book was in Aramaic, and thus intended almost exclusively for Jews. Writing now under the patronage of the Flavians, Josephus had a vested interest in a narrative that did not blame the Romans for the destruction of the temple. The Romans, especially Titus, really did try to save the temple, Josephus is saying. If you have to blame someone, blame the few but powerful Jewish firebrands, who are, by this time, all conveniently dead. Thus, in its Greek translation, it does double duty. To the Jews, it absolves the Flavians of guilt. It thus enables Jews to accept Roman rule with a grudging grace. To the Romans and Greeks, though, it both absolves the Jews as a people for the revolt, while simultaneously, and somewhat in tension with this, asserting that Jews fought bravely. They are not a cowardly people, but a strong and clever group that deserves respect, who, after all, could have stood up to the Romans for as long as they did. Here I have focused on historiography rather than history. It naturally thus raises the question, is any of his narrative actually true? Do we just say that Josephus's agenda was so thick and patent that we can't trust his actual reporting? All histories have the same problem, because all histories hawk a particular narrative for a particular reason. I am not entirely conscious, to be honest, of my own stake in the narrative of this podcast, for example, but try as I might to offer a critical and detached reading, I am sure that there is an underlying bias, that I have picked my winners and losers in this story. If I can digress for a minute, I think that we often are too simplistic in the way that we understand historical biases. Usually we think of it in terms of politics or ideology, that the historian is justifying a political situation or promoting a particular ideological commitment. That is sometimes true. But biases can also be far more complex, and I would contend that while all histories have biases, the causes might not best be located in politics or ideology. In fact, I suspect that the biases of the better, more interesting histories are to be found in the complex psychologies of their writers. My relationship to my mother, for example, might better account for the shape of my story than political or ideological commitments. But that relationship is none of your business, so let's move on. In any case, and fortunately, we can be certain that Josephus did not make up his story out of whole cloth. Roman and Greek writers sporadically comment on the revolt, and their comments line up more or less with Josephus's. Josephus was arguing against other competing histories, though it is unlikely that he would have fabricated facts that could be easily refuted. There are additionally moments when he seems uncomfortable, and his narrative suggests that he is papering over facts that don't really work for him, but which he feels he cannot ignore. A good and famous example of where facts meet historiographical agenda in Josephus is his story of Masada. Josephus is our only literary source for this story, how a last remnant of Jewish rebels held out in this Herodian fortress by the Dead Sea for another 3 years after the destruction of the temple, until, finally facing defeat, they killed themselves rather than surrender to Rome. Josephus somewhat implausibly claims that the source of his intimate knowledge of their last moments derived from 1 or 2 old women, who with their children were the only survivors. Moreover, despite the reconstruction of Masada's first archaeologist, Yigal Yadin, the finds from Masada don't fully support Josephus' story. Masada certainly was captured by the Romans after a long siege, but it is unlikely that the community en masse killed themselves. What is most interesting about Josephus' narrative, though, is its palpable tension. Josephus cannot seem to decide if he wants to praise or condemn the rebel holdouts. On the one hand, these rebels were from a particular group, the Sicarii, whom Josephus strongly condemned, and their act of self-slaughter was contrary to Jewish law and custom. Yet on the other hand, boy, were they brave. They stood up to Rome despite their certain defeat, and died a noble death rather than submit. Even the Roman soldiers, upon entering the fort and surveying the carnage, were awed. In the story of Masada, we see Josephus the historian at work in all his unnerving complexity, combining fact with fantasy in a gripping narrative that is hard to untangle. A while after completing the Jewish War, Josephus set to work on a more ambitious project, the Jewish Antiquities. The Jewish War ran to 7 books, Antiquities would run to 20. Although Josephus does not mention this, he almost certainly modeled his work on that of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian who died about 7 BCE and who authored a 20-book history of Rome entitled Roman Antiquities. In the introduction to his book, Josephus ascribes the origin of the book to his patron. As he says, "Nevertheless, as time went on, as is wont to happen to those who design to attack large tasks, there was hesitation and delay on my part in rendering so vast a subject into a foreign and unfamiliar tongue. However, there were certain persons curious about the history who urged me to pursue it, and above all, Epaphroditus, a man devoted to every form of learning, but especially interested in the experience of history." Josephus completed the work in 93 or 94 CE. This history really begins at the beginning. Josephus begins citing and paraphrasing the Bible from the beginning of creation. The paraphrase runs right through the first 11 books of the Antiquities to the reconstruction of the temple and Nehemiah's story. That is, over half of the Jewish Antiquities is a paraphrase of the Bible. The paraphrase is fascinating in its own right and has been the focus of intense scholarly attention. Josephus, of course, did not, indeed could not, simply summarize the Bible. The biblical narrative is too complex and contradictory to lend itself to such an easy summary. So he made choices and cast the biblical stories in particular ways. Sometimes the motives are easy to deduce. Moses, for example, comes off very well in Josephus's paraphrase, exhibiting all of the cardinal Hellenistic virtues. Josephus tells a story found nowhere in the Bible of Moses, while still in Pharaoh's house, leading the Egyptians to military victory over the invading Ethiopians. The effect of this and other additions was to elevate the prestige of Moses, and by extension, the Jews in Josephus's own time. Other additions have more obscure motives. Josephus relates that the descendants of Seth, the son of Adam, were not only virtuous, but discovered the science of the heavenly bodies and their orderly array. They carved this knowledge on stone pillars so that it might not be lost during the approaching flood. The story is reminiscent of the story of Enoch found in the book of 1st Enoch, combined with elements from the book of Jubilees. Josephus appears to have included this story to explain the origins of astronomical knowledge, which would have been of interest to his readers who were used to Greek and Roman myths of origins. But this and many other additions might have been made for other reasons as well. At the same time, Josephus omits other biblical stories that he thought might have reflected badly on the Jews. In his paraphrase of the Bible, Josephus also includes law. For the most part, these merely repeat the short biblical laws, sometimes combining similar laws from different sections of the Torah in an attempt to harmonize or explain them. Occasionally, though, Josephus goes a bit further. In one passage, for example, Josephus writes, "Let your young men, on reaching the age of wedlock, marry virgins, freeborn, and of honest parents." He then goes on to say that adultery is forbidden, and then continues, "There must be no marriage with a prostitute, since by reason of the abuse of her body, God could not accept her marital sacrifice." The first problem with this passage is that the Torah never says either of these things. It does apply these rules to priests. Here Josephus curiously extends both the rule for men to marry virgins and the prohibition on marrying prostitutes to the entire people. More interesting to me, though, is the mention of a nuptial or marital sacrifice. Although mentioned nowhere in the Bible, Josephus apparently knew of a custom whereby a new bride would offer a sacrifice. Was this meant to apply only when the temple stood? Or does he have a more local, domestic Jewish sacrifice in mind? It's not clear. This passage then illustrates two features of Josephus's legal expansions. First, he shapes or presents the law to put Jews in a good light. Romans and Greeks, just like us, had a table of family values, and marrying unsullied women was one of them. We Jews, Josephus seems to say here, have the same value, even enshrining it in our laws. It is an apologetic tendency still common today in our own society. Second, Josephus supplies tantalizing nuggets of information about Jewish practice in his own day. It is rarely obvious whether these nuggets reflect actual Jewish practice, biblical interpretation, or wishful thinking, but nevertheless, they stand out. After his summary of the Bible and Antiquities, Josephus turns to the Hellenistic period, expanding his discussion in his earlier book, The Jewish War. In this section, Josephus seems to draw on a number of now lost sources and provides valuable information about such matters as the Tobiads, as I discussed in an earlier episode. His account of the Maccabean revolt, based as it is mainly on 1st and 2nd Maccabees, adds little of historical interest. As he picks up his discussion of Herod, he seems to depend heavily on the earlier and now lost source by Nicolaus of Damascus, as I mentioned earlier, we would know very little about Herod without Josephus' testimony. From here, the account largely mirrors the Jewish war, and he finishes his narrative with the description of the awful procurator Gessius Florus in 64 CE. While many passages in the later part of Antiquities repeat, sometimes almost verbatim, what he earlier wrote in the war, there are also several apparent discrepancies, especially in tone or emphasis. Scholars have long fought over the meaning of these discrepancies. Did Josephus forget what he had written earlier? Did he modify his account based on a new source that he possessed? Was the modification due instead to the different audiences to whom the two books were addressed? Or, more cunningly, did he change his presentation to promote his own political agenda? It is frequently difficult to answer such questions. Some scholars, for example, have claimed that Josephus' account of the Pharisees is more sympathetic in Antiquities than it is in war, probably because he supported the bid for power of their successors in Judea in the 90s. Others, though, have denied the very premise that he is more sympathetic toward them in Antiquities. The scholarly jury is still out on this question. At the end of Antiquities, Josephus promised a work on the Judaism of his time, explaining, as he put it, the opinions that we Jews hold concerning God and his essence, as well as concerning the laws. That is why, according to them, we are permitted to do some things, while we are forbidden to do others. Unfortunately, Josephus never got to write this. He did instead manage to produce two more tracts. One, The Life, as I mentioned before, is an autobiography. Life was written as a response to an attack by the historian named Justus of Tiberias, who accused Josephus of organizing the revolt in the Galilee. In response, Josephus dedicates most of the Life to his time in the Galilee, emphasizing his desire to make peace with the Romans. Life appears to have been written not long after Antiquities, and maybe was even meant to be read with it. Around the same time, Josephus composed his last work, called Against Apion. Its putative purpose was to refute the anti-Jewish arguments of a Greek grammarian named Apion who lived in Alexandria. In reality, it is a more far-reaching apologetic of Jews and Judaism. As in Antiquities, but more systematically, Josephus extols both Jewish law and the Jewish lawgiver as paradigms of traditional Hellenistic virtues. He also attempts to refute several specific anti-Jewish arguments, often by citing what he claims to be original sources. The book is particularly interesting for what it tells us about at least one Jew's perception of his identity and religion just 24 years after the destruction of the temple. Josephus' legacy as a man is complex and debatable. Was he truly heroic and present, fighting for his people all the time and within the constraints of his time? Or was he a self-centered traitor and a Roman toady? Probably, of course, he was neither and both. Like most of us, his actions and ideas were not always consistent. He tried, sometimes he failed. His significant legacy was due more to an accident than it was to its inherent merit or contemporary popularity. Yet for all his complexity, his value as a historical guide is unparalleled. And so in the next episode, we will return primarily to Josephus as we trace the declining conditions of the 1st century CE and the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70. You have been listening to the podcast From Israelite to Jew with Michael Sadlow. The original score is by Neil Ginsberg with vocals by Michelle Tattenbaum. Technical assistance was provided by the Language Resource Center and the Instructional Technology Group, both at Brown University. More information can be found at msatlow.blogspot.com or at mlsatlow.com on the public education page. I welcome your comments. Thank you for listening.